Decca Record Studio. This is in West Hampstead or South Hampstead, London, depending upon who you are and who you talk to. Well, I've been talking to my buddy Adam here. Now, Adam has an interesting story. It all occurred here a little bit less than a century ago. Now, Adam, tell me about the beginning of Decca Record that you told me just a few minutes ago before we started recording this on camera.
Yeah, Decca Records, or the name Decca, was invented by a family business called Barnett Samuel and Sons. By the time of the period just before the First World War, the company was run by three first cousins, Wilfred, Conrad, and Frank Samuel. Wilfred and Conrad both lived in South Hampstead. Conrad just around the corner from where we live. The thing about this was that Decca was a trademark. Wilfred, who spoke lots of languages, wanted a word that could, roughly speaking, be pronounced in most European languages. So he came upon this idea of Decca. The cousins sold the family business a year before the Wall Street crash in 1928. The business at the time was called Barnett Samuel and Sons, although it had lots of subsidiaries and bits and pieces. The people that bought the company bought the trademark Decca, but were not allowed to use the term Barnett Samuel, so they simply called the business Decca Gramophones. This business had actually made the very first portable gramophone players in time for the outbreak of the First World War. The business was sold. The new company then bought this building and set up, or at least used this building as a recording studio in the 1950s, long after the Samuel family had ceased to have any involvement. And it's here, therefore, that Decca recorded Lonnie Donegan singing the Lead Belly classic, The Rock Island Line.
Two special requests from the record company. And now, we'd like to play the song which brought me into this whole thing, good or bad. It's a story about the Rock Island Line. Well, the Rock Island Line is a mighty good road. Well, the Rock Island Line is the road to ride. Yeah, the Rock Island Line is a mighty good road. And if you want to ride it, gotta ride it like a find get your ticket at the station on the Rock Island Line. Well, I may be right, I may be wrong. I know you're gonna miss me when I'm gone. Down the Rock Island Line, it's a mighty good road. Well, the Rock Island Line is the road to ride. Yeah, the Rock Island Line is a mighty good road. And if you want to ride it, gotta ride it like a find get your ticket at the station on the Rock Island Line. A, B, C, W, X, Y, Z. Can't see in the cover, but you don't see me. Down the Rock Island Line, it's a mighty good road. Well, the Rock Island Line is the road to ride. Oh, the Rock Island Line is a mighty good road. And if you want to ride it, gotta ride it like a find get your ticket at the station on the Rock Island Line. Hallelujah, I'm safe from sin. Is the Lord coming for to see me again? Where'd he come in? Down the Rock Island Line, it's a mighty good road. Well, the Rock Island Line is the road to ride. Rock Island Line is a mighty good road. And if you want to ride it, gotta ride it like a find get your ticket at the station on the Rock Island Line. Rock Island Line, it's a mighty good road. Rock Island Line is the road to ride. Rock Island Line is a mighty good road. And if you want to ride it, gotta ride it like a find get your ticket at the station on the Rock Island Line.
The song wasn't written by Lead Belly, but he certainly recorded it. And that, you could argue, is the beginning of skiffle.
Who was your grandfather? One of the three cousins?
He was one of the three cousins that came to inherit the family business. He was the grandson of Barnett Samuel, after whom the company was named. They were third-generation immigrants. So his grandfather had come from Eastern Europe, from a place called Stolp, which is now Poland. And the family actually had an artistic tradition. The abstract artist Otto Freundlich was his second cousin. He was a friend of Picasso's. So there was a culture of invention already in the family. But fundamentally, it was a family business involved in making gramophone players. They recorded a few records, not a huge number. They imported musical instruments, strings, banjos, things like that. So when the business was sold in the late 1920s, a company like Rose Morris bought the banjo business, for example, which was branded under the name John Gray. Other parts of the business were purchased by other people. The mini piano business of Eve's staff continued it certainly into the 1950s and beyond, and you see their pianos around. They're fairly small upright pianos. So this was a music business fundamentally. It could be argued that it stemmed originally from a business making pen nibs. And you can.
What's a pen nib?
A pen nib is that tells you. That's the difference in generations. Yeah. The things that you put on fountain pens to write. But the point is, there's a very clear connection technologically between making a pen nib and making a record player stylus for playing records. Indeed, there was the business originally technically began in Sheffield, which is famous as a city of steel. The family weren't successful in getting into that sort of business or cutlery, but they got fairly close. Some bits of the family made knives, which is not that dissimilar. So the metal equipment side of the business was part of it, but it's a family with enormous genealogical reach because it's such a big family that we can trace back to the southwest of England in 1789. My triple great-grandmother was born there, and so all kinds of celebrities are descended from it, notably the women who respectively married Alec Guinness, married David Schwimmer, the actor, and Jonathan Miller are all related, but they were not part of the family business. The family business was confined to Barnet Samuel, who married into this clan of Solomons, which was the family name. But beyond that, the three cousins sold up in 1928. They went their separate ways. Two were actually living not very far from here, and hopefully that will give you an idea of the origins of Decca. Thank you. I hope that's enough for you.
Well, your grandfather.
Yes.
He had a role in choosing the name of Decca.
He did choose the name Decca.
Tell me how that happened.
He just simply was looking for a brand name that would enable him to sell record players throughout Europe. And he spoke English, French, German, Italian, at least, if not more languages. And he thought that would probably sound okay in the different languages. A lot of trademarks have their origin in something very similar.
So what you're telling me is that your grandfather was the one who chose the name, selected the name, and invented the name of Decca.
Yeah.
And it became Decca Records, which is where we are standing right now.
Well,
and this was their studio back in the 1930s, 40s, and 50s, and 60s.
Yes. I'm not sure when it became part of their property, but 31, yeah. One of the curiosities of the sale of the family business is that my parents, who were married in 1956, were told to put together a list of the records that they fancied receiving as a wedding present from Decca. So there were still employees at Decca in the 1950s when Lolly Donegan recorded the Rock Island Line, who had either worked for Wilfred Samuel, my grandfather, or at least knew him, or there was more of a connection than anyone is still letting on between the family. Years later, my elder sister was taught at school by Miss Asher. Miss Asher was the sister, of course, of Jane Asher, the actress.
Baby, baby.
Nina, show me what you've written.
And therefore...
And Peter Asher of Peter and Gordon.
Exactly. And Peter Asher's father was the psychiatrist for Harrow, head of psychiatry for Harrow, when my father was starting off as a general practitioner. And basically what happened was that Gordon was Gordon Waller, and Gordon Waller's father was Noel Waller, who was a local GP in Pinner. So essentially the head of psychiatry's son got together with one of the local doctor's sons to form Peter and Gordon, and used the fact that one of them's sister had an attachment to Paul McCartney in order to gain access to reject songs from the Beatles.
So So you're saying that it's because of the doctor's sons got together and formed Peter and Gordon.
Yeah.
So it was really made from medicine.
Yes.
Okay.
There's no question about
I
that.
appreciate your diagnosis.
Peter and Gordon is definitely a pair of people in the medical business getting together, getting their sons together.
This is where the plaque says that Rock Island Line was recorded here in July of 1954 by Lonnie Donegan. We all remember Lonnie Donegan as having recorded Does Your Chewing Gum Lose Its Flavor on the Bedpost Overnight? And that was a major hit in the United States and here in England. They all recorded in studio number 2 up on the second floor. This became a popular recording studio because on January 1st, 1962, the BeaTles, well, not really the BeaTles, they called themselves the BeaTles, but it was John, Paul, and George, and Pete Best. On December 31st, 1961, the BeaTles drove down here to London from Liverpool. It was a massive snowstorm, but they had a recording session that was set up here for Decca Records. It was arranged by Brian Epstein. When they got here, they were rather ill-prepared. Number one, these young boys, and you have to remember, Paul McCartney was only 19 and a half, George Harrison was a year younger, and John Lennon a year older. Pete Best, he was the drummer at the time. This is before Ringo. This is 8 months before Ringo became the drummer. So they arrived here in this big snowstorm. They got here late. And the Decca Records A&R man was extremely upset because they were late. He was late too, but that didn't matter. The fact that they were late is what upset him. They sang 15 songs. The entire recording session was recorded and it was published on the Beatles #1 anthology. They did a couple songs by the Coasters, a couple songs by Chuck Berry. That was the most popular music at the time. They were really in competition that day with the Tremolos. The Tremolos, Decca Records was looking for a recording artist, and they chose the Tremolos over the Beatles. The Beatles were totally unprepared for this. They were out drinking the night before. Their songs were rather rough. They were all uncultured, unprepared, and out of the 15 songs, they kept playing one after another in hopes of getting better in their sound and their presentation. But nobody liked what they did, except, of course, for Brian Epstein. So they left. Things didn't go well. They got a recording session with EMI in June of '62 with George Martin, 32-year-old producer. And he finally got everything straightened out, and everything worked out much better, and they got a recording contract. That was June 6th of 1962. And on August 10th of 1962, they recorded their first sides with EMI, produced by George Martin, Please Please Me. Ringo wasn't the drummer yet. Ringo didn't become their drummer for another 4 days. Pete Best was already dismissed, so they enlisted the services of Andy White to drum on their first 2 recordings at EMI. In the spring of 1967, Van Morrison came here to record Brown Eyed Girl. He came here about 2 years before with his group called Them, and they recorded Gloria. The Zombies recorded She's Not There in 1964 in this building. In the early 1980s, Eddie Grant had a song called Electric Avenue. But back in 1970, Eddie Grant and the Equals recorded Baby Come Back Here. This entire area, Island Records opened up not too far from here. Chris Blackwell, My Boy Lollipop. Steve Winwood recorded all of his big hits. The Moody Blues recorded here.
We've already said goodbye. Since you gotta go, oh, you better go now. Go now.
In 1967, from May to November, they recorded their second album, Days of Future Past. Now think back 60 years ago, as we reach back and touch this history of what's going to happen here. This local band from Liverpool wants a recording contract. In the blinding snowstorm, they drive south from Liverpool down here to London. They arrived here late. The recording session started off on a bad foot. Everybody was angry. The Beatles, these 4 young kids. Paul and George were still teenagers. John was the only one who was 20 years old. So this is their big break, this local band from Liverpool. And there were so many other bands up there in Liverpool that were trying to do the same thing. They were trying to break out of the rut of being a local band playing in nightclubs for afternoon and evening performances. At the time, John, Paul, and George were just a local band, like all the other local bands up in Liverpool. Jerry and the Pacemakers, the Searchers, they had competition to try to break out and get a recording contract. And the Beatles did what they had to do while still teenagers to get that contract. So they came down here to Decca Records because it was arranged by Brian Epstein. Things didn't go well at all. They got off on the wrong foot from the start. They arrived late, nobody was happy. The Beatles were not in good form. Their voices were hoarse from being out in the cold all day yesterday and the night before. And that morning, they had been out drinking that night before. And that morning, they didn't sound that good. They sang 15 songs. Each one took his turn. George, John, and Paul. They kept adding an additional song because each one, they wanted to sound better than the performance before. But none of them sounded good. Nobody was happy. Everybody knew it was a recording disaster. All the songs were recorded and they were released on a DVD, the Beatles Anthology, #1. They sang skiffle songs. But Paul McCartney wanted to steer the band away from skiffle. So they were getting into rock and roll. They sang Eddie Cochran songs, 20 Flight Rock. That was the song that was used to introduce Paul to John on July 6, 1957 in St. Peter's Church. When you consider the history in rock and roll music and American music and British music, up and down this street, back in the 1950s and 1960s, this is really a place that belongs on the register of rock and roll history. Now we're going to take a walk over to the Abbey Road Studios. You know, the famous zebra crosswalk. Jeff Emmerich was the recording engineer. Nobody, including this local band from Liverpool, had any way of knowing how the Beatles were going to change the world, what they were going to do to music and what they were going to do to our social consciousness. We can't forget that on November 22nd, 1963, President Kennedy was assassinated. Our nation went into a period of mourning. We didn't smile, we didn't laugh, nothing happened. Most all record producing, recording, performances, sales of record stopped. The #1 song for the next 5 weeks was Dominique by the Singing Nun, totally in the French language, but there was no other records being produced that would compete with that. When the Beatles appeared on Ed Sullivan on February 9, 1964, they taught us that we could come out of this period of mourning, this period of depression, we could smile again, and eventually we're going to laugh. They changed everything for us. We were totally captivated by their music and the message that it conveyed. 4.5 years later, John Lennon said to us, "You say you want a revolution?" And we responded, yes. And from that moment on, everything changed. And it all changed up at the EMI Studios at Abbey Road, where that Beatles famous zebra crosswalk is one of the most popular photographs ever taken, and it's one of the most popular tourist attractions here in London. Let's take a walk up there. When you think about it, Paul McCartney was right. It was a long and winding road. From the Decca recording studio, 1.5 miles away, it took him several years to get here. In 1968, inside this studio, John Lennon asked us, "You say you want a revolution?" And we answered yes. We did. And they changed the world. They started out as a local band walking through their first recording studio up at Decca Records. And by the time they got here and finished up 8.5 years later, simply a local band did change the world. We didn't know how it was going to happen or when it was going to happen, but it changed everything. It made us appreciate the power of the message contained in the music. Because even though they recorded mostly in English for all those years, they conveyed a message worldwide in hundreds of different cities in several different countries, all the while showing everybody it didn't matter how long your hair really was. So considering how the world and how the United States looked in 1962, when they walked into the Decca recording studios, and how it looked in 1970, the last time they walked out of a recording studio together as a band, the Fab Four certainly conveyed their message around the world, from the Vietnam War to drugs to our appearance, long hair, wearing different styles of clothes. It all made no difference. These teenage mop tops told us through different kinds of songs and through different types of appearances and different types of dress, you're still the same person inside as when you began at Decca Records and when you exited here at Abbey Road for the final time as a band. We owe them a great debt of gratitude from the very beginning right up through the end. I'm in Ealing's Broadway, far west of London. Not that far because it's an island and it's not that big. You'd be surprised how easy it is to get around in this place. But back in the 1960s, this place opened in 1960. It was run by two partners. And it started out as a jazz club. And then they began to bring in what they learned to be this new music. Now, skiffle music was the most popular thing happening in England back in the 1950s. Anybody in London who wanted to be a first-class performer in the emerging rock and roll had to come here to the Ealing Club because it was jazz and then it converted over to rock and roll. Then after 2 years, it converted back to jazz and then to rock and roll, and then it eventually closed. Paul Jones of Manfred Mann cut his teeth here when he was 19, 20 years old. He began to get exposure and a very well-known reputation for being a rock and roll singer. And all of this is new. If you look back on Bill Haley's Comets, their big hit, Rock Around the Clock, that was published as a foxtrot. Because back in 1955, nobody knew what to call the music. They were calling it rock and roll because of Alan Freed back in 1952 in my hometown of Cleveland, Ohio. But it hadn't caught on yet. So it was labeled at times as being a foxtrot. But here in this building, they were able to cram in well over 1,000 people in the basement. And of course, they got shut down for having too big of a crowd at times, but they were always able to reopen. And all the groups performing in London came out here because they heard that this place was becoming extremely popular with the young kids, and if you had a recording contract and the young kids would come out here to see you perform, they would buy your records. I wanted to get inside, but it's closed, and I'm not sure if it's even open at all at this point. It may be periodically open. There may be a commercial establishment downstairs now, but I won't be here if it is open. So there's quite a crowd that's going back and forth on the other side of the camera. It's a popular place. It's very well known, and the people that look up at the sign and understand why I'm here and why I'm talking about this place, they have an appreciation for that. A lot of these places, the people know the history, but they have this fear that the history is going to get buried, the history is going to be forgotten, that the history is going to be totally ignored as time goes on. But these places, these locations, these establishments, these bars and grills, these theaters, these performing nightclubs were so instrumental in getting rock and roll recognized, getting rock and roll performed, and getting rock and roll played. I'm going to show you some photographs of some of the performers who played on the stage at the bottom of these stairs. Paul Jones met Brian Jones, and they were collaborators together. They both performed here, and obviously their careers overlapped here. A young man named Reginald Dwight also performed here. He changed his name to Elton John. Eric Clapton performed here. And I'm talking, when I say they performed here, this is 1962. Before they had recording contracts, before they became stars, before they were anybody. The Stones weren't even the Rolling Stones when they first performed here. Paul, George, and Ringo came over to the United States and performed on the Ed Sullivan Show. The popularity that exploded at that time, all of the British acts wanted to get in on that. All the record companies wanted to press all this vinyl, take advantage of this extreme popularity of all these acts coming out of England. But these guys played all over up in Liverpool, which is north of here. It's going to be a long train ride. And we're going to go there in a little while.